do another one of our video series, and in this particular one we are going to show you how to do a suspension installation on an NC MX5. First thing we're going to do is go ahead and take the strut tower bars off. That's going to be 14mm nuts on both sides. After that, we're going to go ahead and start unbolting the top mount of the coilover assembly. One thing to keep in mind is that where the strut tower bar, those are separate brackets, they're actually very delicate. If you over torque those, they will snap off very quickly. But we're not going to completely unbolt the top yet. We're just going to go ahead and loosen them so we can get a little bit of movement from the bottom. See, this is a very old set of coilovers. The adjusters on them are completely seized, so they're being taken out in favor of a standard suspension. First thing to do is to go ahead and loosen the upper arm bolts. You'll need to do those on both sides. Then we're going to move down to the bottom, where you're going to go ahead and start loosening the sway bar where it connects down to the bottom. In this case, we have some aftermarket ones. If you have the factory ones, you're going to need a hex wrench to hold the actual threads from moving. And then you're going to loosen the bottom shock bolt. Something to note here is that we're actually doing this on the ground specifically so you can see how you would do this on the ground. Next step is going to be to go ahead and take off the upper A-arms. The easiest way to do this is with a ratcheting wrench. Also, if you have an electric ratchet, you can do this as well, as long as the socket is relatively low profile. It's usually easiest to do this by taking off the brake line. You're going to want to take off the 10mm bolt on the A-arm, as well as loosening the 10mm bolt that goes to the body. That'll give you enough room to move the line out of the way, maneuver the hub assembly, and also be able to get the bolt out of the control arm. The easiest way to remove the bottom shock bolt is going to be with an air gun. You're going to want to be careful, do not use a hammer directly onto the bolt. Use a punch instead, that way it doesn't mushroom out the end. Next step will be to finish removing the top of the mount. You're going to go ahead and take off the 3 nuts that hold it to the body at the top. Once that's done, you're going to go to the top side and loosen the rest of the shock mount, and then you're going to go down to the bottom and continue removing the upper control arm bolts. On the rearmost one, you'll see that the brake line actually gets in the way and you can't completely get in there with a wrench, so that's why we take off the brake line bolt that goes to the body and move the brake line out of the way. You want to be careful to make sure that you remove the gasket that goes in between the body and the shock. That is an important piece that helps quiet things down as you go over bumps. You're going to want to reuse those on your next suspension. Removing the actual shock is going to vary based on the length of the whole assembly. Some of the coilovers are going to be a little bit shorter than some of the standard shocks. And basically what you're going to do is hold the hub assembly so that you're supporting it so that it's not being pulled on the brake line, and then wiggle the bottom of the shock down and then pull it out once you have enough clearance around the fender. And here we're just getting this back in roughly and getting the bolts in just so the assembly is supported while we prepare the new suspension. Putting the new ones in is going to be exactly the opposite of what you just did to take them out. And once you're done with that, you're going to move on to the rear. The rear is a little bit trickier. One thing to keep in mind is that on the top mount, instead of just the top 3 bolts, you actually have 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom. If you forget that one on the bottom, it is not coming out. The sizes are going to be, again, standard metric. You're going to have 14 millimeters for the top, and for the bottom, you're going to have a 12 millimeter. Unlike the front AA arm assembly, the rear is a multi-link. This is going to present a little bit of a challenge, but it's really not that different from doing it from the front. As we did with the front, you're going to want to start off by removing the sway bar end links. The rear shock bolt, just like the front, is going to come off easiest with an air gun. The next step is going to be to remove the upper links. The rear one you can easily get to with an impact. The one towards the front, you're going to likely need a ratcheting wrench. There's no need to remove the brake line for the rear. Once you get the upper links out, what you're going to do is, again, it'll depend on the coilover setup that you have. If they're a little bit longer, you're going to need a little bit more room. But basically, the front one will just get pulled out. The rearmost one, you can usually push the hub down and then grab the top of it and spin it around. That way it's out of the way. That'll give you a lot of room to maneuver the new coilover assembly into position. You might be wondering why we went ahead and swapped out coilovers in favor of a standard suspension. There's a couple of factors here. If you looked at that first shock going up and down, you see that it was smooth throughout the range. If you look at the next shock, you'll see that there's a lot of play in the initial range, and then once it starts to compress, it gets a little bit better. And basically what you have is a blown shock. The other factor here is that this is a northern climate. As you can see by the coilovers, these really did not hold up well to the corrosion at all. Installation will be the reverse of the steps that we just took. Overall, it is not a very difficult job when you have the right equipment. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe and check us out for your suspension needs.